There's a question that doesn't get asked nearly enough in mainstream history, and it starts with something as simple as a map. If you go looking through European cartography from the 1500s all the way through the 1700s, you'll find something that stops you cold. Across dozens of maps, produced by different cartographers, in different countries, in different decades, there is a massive region stretching across Central and Northern Asia that carries the same label: Tartaria. Sometimes it's called Grande Tartary. Sometimes it's broken into subdivisions: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. But the core territory is always there. Always enormous. Always labeled with a consistency that would be remarkable if it referred to something well known. And it becomes genuinely strange when you realize that most people today have never heard of it at all. These aren't obscure documents pulled from forgotten archives. We're talking about maps created by some of the most respected cartographers in European history. Abraham Ortelius, the man widely considered the creator of the first modern atlas, included Tartaria in his 1570 Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. Guillaume de L'Isle, cartographer to the French king, mapped it repeatedly in the early 1700s. The Encyclopædia Britannica's first edition in 1771 contained a detailed entry on Tartary, describing it as a vast territory stretching from Asia Minor to the Pacific. These were not fringe sources. These were the most authoritative references available at the time. Now here's what makes this worth your attention. The region labeled Tartaria on these maps is not small. In many depictions, it rivals or exceeds the size of the Russian Empire, the Chinese dynasties, and the Mughal Empire. It often covers territories we now associate with modern-day Kazakhstan, Mongolia, Siberia, Manchuria, and parts of Central Asia. Some maps extend it into Eastern Europe. Others push its borders toward the Pacific coast. The boundaries shift from cartographer to cartographer, which is normal for the period, but the core identification of a place called Tartaria remains remarkably stable for over 2 centuries. So what do modern history textbooks say about this? Surprisingly little. If you search for Tartaria in most contemporary academic sources, you'll be directed toward the history of the Tatar peoples, a real and well-documented ethnic group with deep roots in Central Asian and Eastern European history. You'll find references to the Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde, the Crimean Khanate. All of these are legitimate historical subjects. But none of them fully account for the scale of what those old maps were depicting. The Mongol Empire, at its height under Genghis Khan, was indeed the largest contiguous land empire in history. But it fragmented in the 13th century. The maps labeling Tartaria were produced centuries later, in the 1600s and 1700s, long after the Mongol Empire had dissolved into successor states. This is where the first real gap appears. If Tartaria on those maps was simply a European term for the post-Mongol territories, why does it persist with such scale and prominence for so long? Why is it treated on 18th-century maps not as a historical relic but as a contemporary geopolitical entity? And why does it vanish almost entirely from cartography by the mid-1800s, replaced by the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, and the borders we recognize today? The standard explanation is that European cartographers were working with incomplete information. That Tartaria was essentially a placeholder, a label applied to a poorly understood region by mapmakers who had limited access to accurate intelligence from the interior of Asia. That's a reasonable explanation, and it accounts for some of the inconsistency in how Tartaria's borders were drawn. But it doesn't fully explain why the label carried such authority for so long, why it appeared in encyclopedias alongside detailed descriptions of governance and culture, or why its disappearance from the map coincides almost exactly with the territorial expansion of the Russian and Chinese empires in the 18th and 19th centuries. None of this proves anything extraordinary on its own. But it raises a legitimate question. When a name appears on the most authoritative maps in the world for over 200 years, is described in major reference works of its time, and then quietly disappears from the historical conversation, that's worth examining more closely. Not to jump to conclusions, but to look at what else lines up. And it turns out, quite a lot does. One of the most striking things you notice when you start looking into this subject isn't something you read. It's something you see. Across multiple continents, In cities that were supposedly built independently by different cultures at different times under different governments, there are buildings that look like they belong to the same civilization. Not vaguely similar. Structurally, aesthetically, and technically similar in ways that are difficult to explain through coincidence or simple architectural trends. Take star forts as a starting point. These are large-scale fortifications built in a distinctive geometric pattern, typically a series of pointed bastions arranged in a star shape, designed to eliminate blind spots for defensive fire. The standard historical explanation is that star forts originated in Renaissance Italy in the 15th century and spread across Europe through military engineering. That part is well documented. Italian architects like Giuliano da San Gallo and later Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban in France refined the design into a military science. But here's where it gets interesting. Star forts don't just appear in Europe. They show up in India, Southeast Asia, Japan, the Caribbean, South America, North America, and across the vast interior of what those old maps labeled Tartaria. Hundreds of them. Many in locations that had no documented contact with Italian military engineers. Some in places where the local population at the time of European arrival reportedly had no knowledge of who built them or when. The conventional explanation is colonial transmission. European powers exported the design wherever they went. That accounts for many of them. But it doesn't account for all of them, and in several cases, the construction timelines are either unclear or don't align comfortably with the colonial narrative. Now move to civic and institutional architecture. In the 19th century, cities across the United States, Europe, Russia, Australia, and parts of Asia constructed enormous public buildings with remarkably similar design language. Massive stone facades, Greco-Roman columns, ornate domed roofs, arched windows with detailed masonry. Interior spaces scaled far beyond what their stated purpose would seem to require. Courthouses in small American towns built to a standard that rivals European palaces. Train stations in rural India that look like they were designed by the same architect who built government halls in St. Petersburg. The official explanation for this is the global popularity of neoclassical and Beaux-Arts architectural styles. These movements were well documented, widely taught, and genuinely influential across the 19th century world. Architects studied the same texts, admired the same classical precedents, and worked within the same aesthetic vocabulary. So some degree of similarity is entirely expected. But the question isn't just about style. It's about scale, speed, and capability. Consider the construction timelines given for many of these buildings. In city after city, the official record states that enormous stone and masonry structures were built within remarkably short timeframes, sometimes just a few years, in locations that had limited infrastructure, small populations, and no obvious access to the skilled labor force such projects would require. Some of these buildings feature multi-story basements, complex ventilation systems, and stonework of a quality that modern builders have difficulty replicating, let alone matching in speed. Take a city like Cincinnati, Ohio. In the mid-1800s, Cincinnati was a growing but still relatively modest frontier city. Yet during this period, it produced civic buildings of extraordinary architectural ambition. The same pattern repeats in Indianapolis, Detroit, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, and dozens of other cities. Grand structures appear in the historical record almost fully formed, often with minimal documentation of their construction process. Photographs from the period sometimes show these buildings standing in otherwise undeveloped landscapes, ornate stone edifices surrounded by dirt roads and wooden shacks, as if the monumental architecture arrived before the city did. There's another physical detail that comes up repeatedly, and it's one that anybody can verify by visiting these buildings in person. Many of them have ground floors that are partially or fully buried. Windows that now sit at sidewalk level were clearly designed to be above ground. Doors open onto walls of earth. In some cities, what are now called basements were originally the main floors of the building. The standard explanation for this is urban fill. Cities raised their street levels over time for drainage, flood management, or infrastructure development. That's well documented in places like Seattle, Chicago, and parts of Portland. But the pattern shows up in so many cities, across so many continents, that the question becomes whether urban fill alone accounts for all of it, or whether some of these structures are significantly older than their official construction dates suggest. None of these observations constitute proof of a single lost civilization. Architectural movements spread. Engineering knowledge travels. Styles go in and out of fashion globally. All of that is true. But when you line up the visual similarities, the construction timelines, the buried floors, and the geographic spread, a pattern forms that at minimum deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives. Because these buildings don't just look similar in a general sense. They look like they were built by the same people. If the architecture raises questions about what was built, the historical record of the 19th century raises equally important questions about what was destroyed. Between roughly 1850 and 1910, an extraordinary number of major cities around the world experienced catastrophic fires. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is probably the most famous, but it was far from alone. In that same year, the city of Peshtigo, Wisconsin burned in what remains the deadliest fire in American history. Across the lake, large sections of Michigan burned simultaneously. In the years surrounding these events, significant urban fires struck San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, Baltimore, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Toronto, London, Moscow, Hamburg, Constantinople, and dozens of other cities. Fires in densely built 19th century cities are not surprising in themselves. Wooden construction, gas lighting, limited firefighting capacity, and rapid urbanization created genuinely dangerous conditions. That context matters, and it explains why major fires were common during this period. What draws attention, though, is not just the frequency of these fires but what happened afterward. In city after city, the fire is followed by a remarkably rapid phase of reconstruction. Grand masonry buildings, the same style of ornate, neoclassical structures discussed in the previous chapter, appear in the official record within just a few years of the destruction. In Chicago, a city supposedly leveled in 1871, enormous stone buildings were being photographed by the mid-1870s. The speed of this rebuilding, the architectural quality of the new structures, and the limited documentation of the actual construction process raised practical questions. Where did the materials come from? Who provided the skilled labor? How were such complex buildings erected so quickly in a period before modern construction equipment? The standard answer is that the Industrial Revolution provided the means, railroads moved materials, a growing labor force provided workers, and the urgency of rebuilding drove rapid construction. All of that is plausible and partially documented. But in several cases, the photographic record creates complications. Some post-fire photographs show grand buildings standing among rubble in ways that make them look less like new construction and more like surviving structures from a previous era. The buildings don't always look new. The rubble around them doesn't always look like construction debris. This is where the World's Fairs enter the conversation, and where the questions get considerably more interesting. Beginning in the mid-1800s, a series of international expositions and World's Fairs took place in major cities around the globe. London's Crystal Palace Exhibition in 1851. The Paris Expositions of 1855, 1867, 1878, 1889, and 1900. The Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of 1876. And most notably, the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, commonly known as the White City. The White City is worth spending time on. According to the official history, the 1893 Chicago Exposition involved the construction of over 200 buildings across 690 acres of parkland. The structures were monumental in scale, enormous domed halls, colonnaded facades, reflecting pools, sculptures, and infrastructure for millions of visitors. All of this was reportedly designed, built, used for a 6-month fair, and then almost entirely demolished. The photographs of the White City are freely available and worth examining closely. What you see in those images are not temporary exhibition halls. You see massive neoclassical buildings constructed with apparent precision, detailed ornamentation, grand staircases, and architectural features that would be ambitious for permanent construction even today. The official narrative states that most of these buildings were made of a temporary material called staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber applied over wooden and steel frames. After the fair, nearly everything was torn down. The same pattern repeats at other world's fairs. Enormous, architecturally stunning complexes are built, photographed, and then destroyed. In almost every case, the official explanation is that the structures were temporary, made of impermanent materials, and always intended to be demolished. The photographs, however, show buildings that look permanent, solid, and far too detailed for disposable construction. Several questions emerge from this pattern, and they're worth stating clearly. Why were so many resources, financial, material, and human, devoted to constructing monumental buildings that were planned for demolition from the start? If the technology and labor existed to build these complexes in the timeframes claimed, why wasn't that same capacity applied to permanent urban development? Why do the buildings in World's Fair photographs look so similar to the civic buildings that appeared in cities worldwide during the same period? And why do so few detailed construction records for these fair complexes survive, while the demolition is well documented? None of these questions have easy answers. The mainstream explanation that the fairs were showcases of industrial capability, built quickly with temporary materials as demonstrations of progress, is coherent and supported by some documentation. But it doesn't fully satisfy the visual evidence. And when you place the fair buildings, the post-fire reconstruction, and the global pattern of similar architecture side by side, the conventional narrative begins to feel less like a complete explanation and more like a partial one. Something was built. Something was destroyed. The timeline in between is where the most important questions live. At this point, it's important to step back from the visual patterns and look directly at the documentary evidence. Because whatever conclusions anyone draws about Tartaria, architecture, or historical timelines, those conclusions need to be measured against what the written record actually says. The word Tartar, or Tatar, has a long and documented history. It appears in Chinese sources as early as the 5th century, referring to nomadic groups in the Mongolian steppe. By the time of the Mongol conquests in the 13th century, European writers had adopted the term broadly, sometimes applying it specifically to the Mongol armies, sometimes using it as a general label for the peoples of the Central Asian interior. The conflation of Tatar with Tartar, the latter carrying deliberate overtones of Tartarus, the classical underworld, tells us something about European perceptions, but it also muddies the historical water considerably. What's well documented is that European travelers did visit the regions labeled Tartaria on those old maps, and they wrote about what they found. Marco Polo's 13th century accounts describe a sophisticated empire under Mongol rule, with organized trade routes, advanced postal systems, and cities of considerable size. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who journeyed across much of Asia in the 14th century, described Tatar territories with functioning governance, established commerce, and cultural complexity. Later European diplomatic missions in the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly those sent to Moscow and onward into Central Asia, produced reports describing the peoples and territories of what they called Tartary. These accounts are broadly consistent with mainstream history. They describe a post-Mongol landscape of successor states, khanates, and tribal confederations spread across a vast territory. The Crimean Khanate, the Khanate of Kazan, the Uzbek Khanate, the Dzungar Khanate, these are all documented political entities with traceable histories. None of this is hidden or suppressed. It's in the academic record, available to anyone who looks. But here's where the record gets less straightforward. The Encyclopædia Britannica's first edition, published in 1771, contains an entry on Tartary that describes it not as a collection of remnant khanates, but as a coherent geographic entity. The greatest empire on earth, stretching across most of Asia. The language is notably matter-of-fact. It doesn't describe Tartary as a historical artifact or a fading memory. It describes it as a present reality. By the time later editions of the Britannica were published in the 19th century, the entry had been significantly reduced and eventually reframed entirely. Tartary went from being a vast contemporary territory to a historical footnote. The transition is worth tracking carefully. In the late 18th century, The Russian Empire was expanding aggressively eastward across Siberia and into Central Asia. Simultaneously, the Qing dynasty in China was consolidating control over Manchuria, Mongolia, and parts of Turkestan regions that earlier maps had labeled as various forms of Tartary. By the mid-19th century, the territories that had carried the Tartaria label for centuries were fully absorbed into Russian and Chinese administrative control. The mainstream explanation is that Tartaria was never a unified empire, it was a European cartographic convention applied to poorly understood territories, and as European knowledge improved and those territories were absorbed by neighboring empires, the label naturally fell out of use. That explanation is reasonable and has supporting evidence. But the speed and completeness of the transition deserve attention. Within roughly a century, a name that had appeared on every major map of Asia for over 200 years disappeared entirely from common usage. The cultural and architectural heritage of the regions involved was reframed under new national narratives. In Russia, the history of Siberia was rewritten as a story of Russian exploration and settlement. In China, the histories of Manchuria and Mongolia were integrated into the broader narrative of Chinese civilization. The Tatar identity survived in specific ethnic communities, but the larger concept of Tartaria as a geopolitical entity was effectively retired. What's difficult to determine is whether this represents a natural evolution in geographic knowledge or something more deliberate. When an empire absorbs a territory, it typically rewrites the history of that territory to legitimize its own control. This isn't conspiracy, it's standard imperial practice, documented everywhere from the Roman Empire to the British Raj. The question is whether the same process applied to whatever Tartaria actually was, and if so, how much of the original history was lost, modified, or deliberately replaced. There are specific gaps in the record that are worth noting without overstating. Construction records for many 19th century buildings are incomplete or missing. Census data for newly absorbed territories in Russia and China from this period contains inconsistencies. Photographic evidence from the late 1800s sometimes conflicts with official narratives about urban development timelines. None of these gaps prove anything by themselves. But taken together, they suggest that the historical record for this period and these regions is less complete than we tend to assume. The honest assessment is this: mainstream history provides a coherent framework for understanding the disappearance of Tartaria from the map. But that framework contains enough holes, enough unanswered questions, and enough reliance on assumption rather than documentation that it cannot be considered fully settled. The record is incomplete. Whether that incompleteness is accidental or meaningful is a question that each person has to evaluate for themselves. So where does all of this leave us? We started with maps. Hundreds of maps, spanning more than 2 centuries, produced by the most respected cartographers in Europe, all showing a vast territory called Tartaria. That territory is real in the cartographic record. Its presence is not disputed. What's disputed is what it represented: a genuine political entity, a cultural designation, or simply a label for the unknown. We looked at architecture. Across multiple continents, buildings share design features, construction techniques, and aesthetic details that are strikingly consistent. The standard explanations: global architectural movements, colonial transmission of styles, the influence of shared classical precedents account for much of this. But they don't fully explain the scale, the speed of construction, or the physical anomalies like buried ground floors that appear in cities worldwide. We examined a pattern of destruction and reconstruction in the 19th century: devastating fires followed by rapid rebuilding, world's fairs that produced monumental architecture only to demolish it, and a timeline that doesn't always hold up comfortably under scrutiny. The mainstream explanations for each individual event are plausible. But the accumulation of similar patterns across so many locations and such a compressed time frame is harder to dismiss as pure coincidence. We reviewed the historical documentation and found that it tells 2 stories depending on when you look. Before the mid-1800s, Tartaria is present in major reference works as a real and significant territory. After the mid-1800s, it fades into a footnote. The transition coincides exactly with the territorial expansion of the Russian and Chinese empires into the regions that previously carried the Tartaria name. This is consistent with standard imperial history, but it also means that the narrative we inherited about these territories was shaped by the very powers that absorbed them. It's important at this point to be clear about what we're not saying. We are not saying that a secret advanced civilization was deliberately erased from history by a global conspiracy. We are not saying that the buildings of the 19th century were built by a lost empire. We are not saying that historical fires were intentionally set to destroy evidence of a previous culture. Those are interpretations that exist within the broader Tartaria discussion, and people can evaluate them on their own terms. But this video is not making those claims. What this video is doing is pointing out that the historical record contains patterns that are genuinely interesting and not fully explained by conventional narratives. When maps show the same thing for 200 years, that's worth understanding. When buildings on different continents share the same unusual features, that's worth investigating. When the same sequence of destruction and rapid reconstruction plays out in city after city during the same narrow time period, that's worth asking about. And when a name that appeared in encyclopedias as the greatest empire on Earth disappears from mainstream awareness within a generation, that's worth noticing. History is not a finished product. It's an ongoing process of discovery, revision, and reinterpretation. Every generation inherits a version of the past that was shaped by the priorities, limitations, and agendas of the people who wrote it. That doesn't mean the inherited version is wrong. But it means that questioning it carefully, honestly, and with respect for evidence is not only reasonable, it's necessary. The buildings are still standing. The maps are still in the archives. The photographs are still available. The questions are there for anyone willing to look. All you have to do is pay attention.